Welcome to the Thinking Out Loud podcast show.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. You ready to dive into another deep dive?
Always.
This one's a doozy, though.
Oh, yeah.
This is one you'll want to pay attention to, even if you think you've heard it all, because this could really change things up.
Definitely.
So we're talking Project 2025. You might not have heard of it.
I hadn't.
It's kind of under the radar, but it's a whole set of recommendations to completely change how the government operates.
Oh, wow.
And we're talking everything from like justice to education to even healthcare.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty huge. And we've got a whole stack of sources here that outline all these different recommendations, and they're pretty intense.
Yeah. I mean, from what I've seen, it's not just like little changes here and there. It's like rethinking the whole system.
Yeah, it's not just tweaking. It's like a total makeover.
Right. A complete overhaul.
Yeah. And it's kind of scary, to be honest.
Yeah, I can see that.
I mean, we're talking about reshaping things like the Justice Department, education. Oh, this one's a big one. Potentially dismantling parts of the Affordable Care Act.
Whoa.
So where do we even start with all of this?
Well, I think the Department of Justice is a good place to jump in.
Okay.
Because the recommendations there are pretty wild.
Wild how?
Well, they're talking about a potential ideological shift.
Okay.
With career staff possibly being replaced by political appointees.
Wait, so instead of people who've like worked their way up and have the expertise, we could have people who were just there because of their political beliefs.
Potentially.
That's making me nervous already. I mean, does that mean that like federal investigations and prosecutions could become, I don't know, less about the facts and more about politics?
Yeah, it definitely raises questions about whether law enforcement would stay impartial. Or if it could become a tool for certain agendas.
Oh man. That's a scary thought.
It's a big concern.
Okay, let's move on to education. Project 2025 is calling for something they're calling local control and curriculum transparency. So does that mean like less say-so from the federal government?
Yeah.
And more power to like individual states and districts?
That's essentially what they're proposing. Yeah.
Okay, so what would that actually look like in schools?
Oh, you could end up with this situation where the quality of your kid's education really depends on your zip code.
Oh, wow.
Like one state could have amazing schools, while another state is totally lagging behind. And what about protections for students, especially those from marginalized groups?
Right.
Could those disappear in some areas?
So a real mixed bag for parents and kids across the country.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Okay. This deep dive is already making my head spin. And we haven't even gotten to healthcare yet, which is another huge piece of this.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about potentially dismantling the Affordable Care Act and moving to a more market-driven approach to healthcare. What does that even mean?
Well, one of the big ideas is giving states block grants for healthcare.
Block grants.
Yeah. So basically, each state gets a chunk of money, and then they decide how to spend it.
Yeah.
They're also talking about getting rid of a lot of the federal rules about what insurance has to cover.
So like what happens to people with pre-existing conditions? Would they still be protected under this new system?
That's a big question.
And what about the overall cost of healthcare? Would it go up, down?
It's hard to say for sure.
Okay. I'm getting a little nervous just thinking about this. It seems like there's a pattern here.
What do you mean?
Like less involvement from the federal government, more power to individual states, and a bigger reliance on the free market to kind of sort things out.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
But is that always a good thing?
I don't know.
I'm starting to wonder if all this deregulation might leave people, and maybe even the environment, a little vulnerable.
That's a really important question, and one we're going to explore further as we keep digging into this.
Okay, so less federal oversight, more state control, and a whole lot of question marks.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
Let's take a closer look at what this could mean for the environment next. Project 2025 recommends something they're calling massive deregulation of the EPA.
Massive deregulation.
Yeah, it sounds pretty intense. So what does that actually look like? Are we talking about like rolling back existing environmental protections?
Yeah.
Or maybe even getting rid of entire mechanisms altogether?
Well, it seems like it could be a bit of both.
Yeah.
They're talking about cutting back federal control over things like pollution from factories.
Right.
And potentially leaving it up to individual states to set their own standards.
Wait, so we could have a situation where like one state has really strict environmental rules
Yeah.
and their neighbor has basically none.
It's possible.
Wouldn't that just mean that pollution could like drift across state lines? making the whole thing pointless?
Oh, that's one of the concerns, yeah.
And what about things like clean drinking water? Would that be at risk too?
Potentially, yes.
So we could end up with this like patchwork of environmental regulations across the country.
Yeah, that's a real possibility.
With some states prioritizing like economic growth, overprotecting the environment.
Exactly.
And that could have some serious consequences, not just for individual states, but for the whole country.
It's a big concern.
Okay, so potentially a lot of good intentions, but maybe so potentially a mixed bag for workers as well.
It's definitely complex.
While we're on the topic of deregulation, let's talk about what Project 2025 has in store for financial markets.
Right.
It seems they want to roll back some of the Dodd-Frank regulations and ease up on oversight of financial institutions. Didn't Dodd-Frank come about after like the 2008 financial crisis to prevent that kind of thing from happening again?
That's right.
So why are they talking about rolling those back now?
Well, the idea seems to be to reduce what some see as unnecessary red tape.
Okay.
And encourage innovation and growth in the financial sector.
So like they're trying to find a balance between promoting economic growth, but also protecting consumers from another like 2008 situation.
Exactly.
That seems like a tough tightrope to walk.
It definitely is.
I'm seeing a theme emerging here.
What's that?
Less federal involvement, more power to individual states, and this belief that the free market can generally sort things out. But is that always the case? And how would all of this actually play out in the lives of everyday Americans? Would things get better, worse, or just different?
Those are the big questions, and they're not easy to answer.
It seems like the potential impact of this is vast.
It is.
And it's crucial for everyone to understand what's being proposed and to engage in like thoughtful conversations about the potential consequences.
Couldn't agree more.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still so much to unpack.
Absolutely.
We've looked at potential changes to the Justice Department, education, healthcare, the environment, labor, and even financial markets.
Yeah, we've been busy.
And while there might be some potential upsides, it seems like there are a lot of potential downsides too.
There are definitely risks involved.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. But now I want to dive even deeper into how these proposed changes could actually affect different communities and industries across the country.
Sounds good to me.
That's what we'll be talking about in our next segment.
Can't wait.
So make sure you come back for part 2. Because we're just getting started. Okay, so we've laid out the framework of Project 2025, this like massive potential shift in how the government works, with a lot of power moving away from Washington and toward individual states. But how would this actually play out in the real world? How would it affect, like, you, the listener? Let's get into some specifics.
Okay, let's think about healthcare again. Remember we talked about those block grants and less federal oversight?
Yeah.
Well, imagine you live in a rural area where there's already not a lot of choice when it comes to doctors and hospitals.
Yeah, I've heard stories about people in rural areas having to drive like hours to see a specialist. Not already tough for them.
Exactly. Now imagine your state gets this big chunk of money for healthcare, but they don't spend it wisely. Or maybe they decide to prioritize certain types of care over others. Suddenly that long drive to see a specialist could become even longer, or maybe even impossible.
That's heartbreaking. And what about people with pre-existing conditions?
Yeah.
We talked about how the Affordable Care Act protected them. But with Project 2025, those protections could go out the window.
Yeah, that's a real concern.
Imagine you have like diabetes or asthma, and you're worried about being able to afford your medication. Under Project 2025, insurance companies could potentially deny you coverage or charge you so much that you can't afford it.
That's a very real possibility.
Okay, so healthcare in a world shaped by Project 2025 could look very different, and not necessarily in a good way.
Yeah, especially for people who are already struggling.
What about the impact on education? We talked about states having more control over schools.
Right.
But what does that actually mean for students and parents?
Well, think about what happens when each state gets to decide what's taught in schools. One state could have a curriculum focused on critical thinking and problem solving, while another state might prioritize rote memorization or even push a specific ideology.
Wow, so your kid's education could really depend on where you happen to live.
It's a possibility.
That doesn't seem fair.
And then there's the issue of funding. Some states might invest heavily in their schools, while others might cut back. So you could have a situation where kids in one state have access to amazing teachers and resources, while kids in another state are stuck in overcrowded classrooms. with outdated textbooks.
This is making me think about how Project 2025 could widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Not just in education, but in other areas too.
It's a valid concern.
It feels like it could create a system where your zip code determines your opportunities in life.
Yeah, that's a worry for a lot of people.
And it's something we see playing out in the labor market as well. Remember, Project 2025 proposes weakening those federal protections for workers.
Right.
Imagine you're working a gig job, like driving for a ride-sharing company or delivering food.
The gig economy is huge these days.
Yeah.
But under Project 2025, it could become even harder for those workers to get a fair shake.
How so?
Well, companies could classify more and more people as independent contractors, which means they wouldn't have to provide benefits.
Oh, like health insurance or paid time off.
Exactly.
So you could be working your tail off, but you're not getting the same protections.
And benefits, as someone who's considered a traditional employee,
That's the concern.
that feels like a recipe for exploitation.
It's a risk, for sure.
And then there's the impact on unions. Project 2025 could make it much harder for workers to organize and bargain collectively.
Right.
That could lead to a situation where individual workers have very little leverage when negotiating with powerful corporations.
It would definitely shift the balance of power.
It feels like we're talking about a fundamental shift in the balance of power between workers and employers, and not necessarily in a good way for workers.
That's one of the big debates surrounding this whole project.
Okay, so we've talked about healthcare, education, and the labor market. Let's not forget about the environment.
Oh, right.
We touched on the potential for massive deregulation of the EPA and how that could lead to a patchwork of environmental rules across the country. But how would that actually affect people in their everyday lives? Well, imagine you live in a state that decides to relax its clean air standards to attract more businesses.
Okay.
Maybe you start noticing that the air quality in your city is getting worse. You're having more respiratory problems. Your kids are getting sick more often. Or maybe you rely on well water, but a nearby factory is allowed to dump pollutants into the groundwater, contaminating your drinking water.
That's terrifying. It feels like we'd be taking a huge step backward.
Yeah.
In terms of environmental protection.
There's a real concern.
And remember, environmental problems don't stop at state lines. Pollution can travel in the air and water, affecting people far beyond the source.
Exactly.
So even if your state has strong environmental protections, you could still be affected by what's happening in neighboring states.
That's right.
This whole thing feels like a giant domino effect, with one change leading to another, and the consequences rippling out in unpredictable ways.
That's a good way to put it.
So Project 2025 is complex and potentially so impactful. It's not just about tweaking a few policies. It's about fundamentally reshaping the role of government in our lives.
Yeah.
Right. And the consequences, both good and bad, could be felt for generations to come.
It's a big deal.
Okay, so we've explored how Project 2025 could impact healthcare, education, the labor market, and the environment. But let's bring this back to the individual level. How might these changes affect the average person's day-to-day life? Would things feel noticeably different?
That's a great question, and the answer is it depends.
On what?
Well, your experience will likely be shaped by where you live, what kind of job you have, your health status, and a whole host of other factors.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Definitely not.
Some people might benefit from these changes, while others might feel the negative effects more acutely.
Exactly.
And that's why it's so important for everyone to understand what's being proposed.
Yeah.
And to think critically about how these changes might affect them personally.
Couldn't agree more.
So far, we've focused on, potential downsides of Project 2025, but are there any potential benefits?
Well, proponents of Project 2025 argue that it would lead to a more efficient and responsive government.
Yeah.
They say that by giving more power to states, we can tailor solutions to local needs and preferences. They also believe that reducing federal regulations would unleash economic growth and create more opportunities for businesses and individuals.
So the idea is that less government interference would lead to more freedom and prosperity.
That's the basic argument.
But of course, there's no guarantee that those outcomes would actually materialize.
Right.
And even if they did, we'd have to weigh those benefits against the potential costs, like the ones we've been discussing.
Exactly. It's a balancing act.
It's a complex trade-off, for sure. And it's one that we need to be having a serious conversation about as a nation.
Absolutely.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface. In our next segment, we'll look at how these proposed changes could play out in different communities and industries across the country, and we'll explore some of the broader implications for the future of American society.
It's going to be a fascinating discussion.
I can't wait. Listeners, make sure you stick around. For the final part of our deep dive into Project 2025, we're just getting to the good stuff. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Project 2025. We've talked about the big picture, but now I want to really zero in on how these changes might actually play out in different corners of the country.
Sounds good.
Let's start by heading to rural America.
Okay.
Remember we talked about healthcare potentially becoming a lot more state-driven?
Yeah.
Well, in rural areas where access to healthcare is already limited, these changes could really hit hard.
I could see that.
I mean, you could see small hospitals and clinics closing in areas that are already underserved.
Right.
And finding affordable insurance, especially if you have a pre-existing condition, could become a real nightmare.
It's definitely a concern.
And it's not just healthcare. Think about education. If funding and decisions about what's taught are left up to individual states, rural schools could really struggle to keep up.
Yeah, they're already at a disadvantage in a lot of cases.
Right, this could really widen the gap between rural and urban schools. And what about the environment? We talked about the potential for states to set their own pollution rules. Wouldn't that be risky for areas that are already struggling with environmental problems?
It's definitely a risk. We could see a rollback of clean air and water standards in some states, which could mean more respiratory problems, contaminated drinking water, and other health issues.
Okay, so it paints a pretty bleak picture for rural America. It seems like these changes could make life even tougher for people who are already facing a lot of challenges.
A valid concern.
Okay, let's shift gears and head to the city. How might Project 2025 shake things up in urban areas?
Well, one area that could see a big impact is the labor market.
Okay.
Cities are full of gig workers, people driving for ride-sharing apps, delivering food, doing freelance work.
Yeah, the gig economy is booming in cities.
Right, but under Project 2025, it could become a lot harder for those workers to get a fair deal.
In what way?
Well, remember, we talked about the possibility of companies being able to classify more workers as independent contractors.
Right.
So instead of being considered employees, they'd be treated like freelancers. Which means no benefits, no paid time off, no protections.
That sounds rough.
It could be. And with unions potentially having less power, it could be harder for those workers to band together and fight for their rights.
So potentially a tougher landscape for gig workers in cities.
It's something to watch for sure.
And while we're on the topic of cities, let's talk about housing.
Okay.
Cities are already struggling with sky-high rents and home prices. Could Project 2025 make things even worse?
It's definitely a possibility.
Oh.
Remember, Project 2025 proposes rolling back some of the regulations that were put in place after the 2008 housing crisis?
Yeah, those rules were supposed to prevent another meltdown.
Right, but with those rules loosened, we could see a return to the risky lending practices that led to the housing bubble in the first place.
Oh, no.
And if that happens, we could see another crash, which would be devastating for homeowners and renters alike.
So Project 2025 could make the housing crisis in cities even worse.
It's a risk we have to consider.
Okay, so we've seen how these changes could impact people in rural areas and cities. But what about specific industries? Are there any sectors that would be particularly vulnerable under Project 2025?
Well, one industry that comes to mind is healthcare.
Okay.
We've already talked about how a shift to a more state-based system could create a lot of uncertainty and potentially lead to higher costs and less coverage for some people.
Yeah, that's a big one. What about industries that rely on environmental regulations, like clean energy or sustainable agriculture?
Those industries could face some headwinds if environmental regulations are rolled back. It might become harder for them to compete with industries that are less environmentally friendly.
So some potential winners and losers, depending on the industry.
It seems that way.
It seems like Project 2025 could really reshape the economic landscape.
It could have a profound impact.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about potential impacts on rural communities, urban areas, and specific industries. But at the end of the day, what does all of this mean for the average American?
That's the big question, isn't it? And as we've seen, there's no easy answer. The impact of Project 2025 will depend on so many factors. Where you live, what you do for work, your health, your values.
It's a lot to process, that's for sure.
It is. But it seems like the main takeaway is that this is something we need to be paying attention to. Project 2025 represents a potential turning point for our country, and it's crucial that we all understand what's at stake and engage in this conversation.
I couldn't agree more.
Whether you support these changes or oppose them, the important thing is to stay informed, to talk about these issues with your friends and family, and to make your voice heard.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into Project 2020. I hope you found this discussion informative and maybe even a little thought-provoking.
We encourage you to continue this conversation and to think critically about the future you want for yourself and for our country.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay curious